Hello, everybody. We're now going into part 4 of Trouble in Ireland, Partition and its Consequences. And this episode is episode 4, and it's called Insurgency and Counter-Insurgency. We're dealing with the early 1970s, roundabout up to 1974. I was intending to do this as the whole of the 1970s as a one-parter, but I'm afraid we're going to have to turn the second half of the 70s going into the early 80s as a separate episode, which will be episode 5. But this part deals with the early 1970s after the arrival of the British Army on the streets of Belfast and Derry, and then quickly expanding out into the countryside from there. So this picture I thought was quite a good one. It's sort of semi-humorous because this wee boy there on the right, despite the army on the streets, armed to the teeth, and in his way, this little boy doesn't look as though he's gonna stand for that, and he's gonna knock the rifle out of the way, rather than let the soldier intimidate him. And I think this attitude sums up a lot of what the British Army had to face in the period, because they were basically seen as an occupying army. Right, so in the final slide of part 3, which you can go back and you can have a look at part 3 if you like. We showed the British Army squaddies in late 1969, newly arrived on the streets of a burning Belfast. The local so-called security forces, they had actually lost control completely, and it was fast turning into a sectarian pogrom. But for our critique, let's start to analyze why and how the popular perception of the friendly welcome, which is portrayed in the image above, how it changed within a very short period of time to the opposite. That's the picture on the right there. And this conflict was destined to become as much of a media war as a military one. In the beginning, British media, when the soldiers first arrived, they were very keen to promote the cups of tea trope, to normalize the soldiers' presence. Now, these incidents did actually happen, but the media focus helped to distort it out of proportion to reality, because as soon as they heard about an event like this, all the journalists at the BBC Northern Ireland or whatever, they would descend on this incident, and they would snap it up, and they would film it and stuff, and it would really distort it out of all proportion to realities, simply because a very deep suspicion of the army's motives and that of the state controlling it was in fact endemic in both Catholic and Protestant working class areas of Northern Ireland. Not so much in middle class areas, of course, but in certainly in working class areas, because nobody knew quite why they were there, and there was very deep suspicion, especially in Republican circles, but also beyond Republican circles, as to like what they were there for, because history has a tendency, especially in the colonial context, to keep on repeating itself. Okay. Now, much of the direction in which the conflict would take, this was to be the responsibility of the senior British officers shown there on the left. All these men were veterans of many different colonial campaigns, and they understood from the onset that their task would be ultimately to apply the very same tactics and achieve the state's desired end, namely pacification of the unruly subhuman natives, to use the sort of terminology which they would never dare to use, but in fact, if you look at reality, is often the case. So of the three officers shown, the most influential in Northern Ireland would be Brigadier Frank Kitson, who's on the extreme right there of the picture, appropriately enough, next to a young Queen Elizabeth II. His reputation as an advisor in her royal circle would survive the infamy that he later attracted, even becoming her royal aide-de-camp for 2 years in the 1980s. So this man was right in there with the core of the British establishment, people from private schools and from a certain class of people within British politics and the British establishment, and he was seen as being a confidant of the Queen, so a trusted confidant. So therefore, any attempt to remove the Queen from any responsibility in what would happen, I'm afraid, does not stick with facts. Right, so Kitson was the author of the 1971 Low Intensity Operations. You can see that book there on the left, and that was the original cover, and it drew little attention from outside military circles until much later on, when the tactics they espoused were well underway in Northern Ireland. The style of writing is remarkable for its portrayal of human beings, social movements, and the desire for freedom as inanimate objects on which the hegemonic power has to exert control, employing coercion and ruthless violence as required to serve the state's interests. In his previous colonial service, of note in Kenya and Malaya in particular, Kitson was decorated and praised for his abilities, and he is still the holder of both MBE and OBE awards. The OBE he got a little bit later on. The MBE he was given shortly after he got back from Kenya. So these two pictures show the two men who would be principal architects in putting the ideology of low intensity operations into practice, the military ideology of it. And you can see Kitson at the top. He is the CEO of the commanding officer of the Belfast area, and Derek Wilford was the commanding officer of the UK's 1st Parachute Regiment, who would later come into a lot of infamy, which we'll be talking about. So Kitson at the top, and you've got Wilford at the bottom. And these two men were going to have a significant influence on the outcome of events in the early 1970s. Right, before we move on to other topics, we'll consider for a moment how then Brigadier Now, today, a general, still alive, he is. Kitson earned his honors. I think he's 98 at the moment. The heroism that brought him such high prestige and decoration in the service of the British Empire, and the experience that he was bringing to Northern Ireland from 1970. The pictures on the left are from the suppression of the 1950s Malayan uprising, which is a communist peasant uprising. And it involved village burnings, it involved arbitrary execution, and it involved the mass beheadings of alleged insurgents. You can see the picture at the bottom. I mean, both these pictures are quite traumatic. The man at the top has obviously been tortured, and he's probably going to be shot for his pains. And the British soldier at the bottom, you can see he's holding two heads. One is a woman, and one is a man. These are the two of the victims of the mass beheadings campaign. And you can see he looks very pleased with himself. And then the one below is of the so-called Mau Mau rising in Kenya, which was largely the Kikuyu people. And they used, they rounded up as many Kikuyu as they possibly could, and they interned them in concentration camps where torture was a daily experience of forced labor, and castrations made with specially made tools and no anesthetic. There was a British journalist. This information was kept state secret. This is what the British state is very good at, keeps everything under wraps for as long as possible, and then they finally release it into the public. And in the it was either late 1990s or the early 2000s, the Kenyan stuff of the 1950s was finally allowed to be released, and a very diligent investigative journalist got on top of the information, and she exposed exactly what had gone on in these camps. You can see a group of terrified Kikuyu people being rounded up there in the villages, and they're about to be taken off to one of these internment camps. And these castrations with specially made tools did actually happen. It was actually recorded in the documents, the state documents, and that were finally released. And the people who had been for years saying that they'd been through this treatment were finally listened to. Of course, there weren't very many of them left by the early 2000s, which suited the British state very well. Right, we'll move on. So to return to the politics of Northern Ireland in this period, the former Unionist monolith, that's the Unionist Party, is with its control over every aspect of the Northern Ireland statelet, that continues to fall apart in the period immediately following British intervention. If you recall from part 3, this process was already beginning with Terence O'Neill, but and his immediate successor Chichester Clark, but he's replaced in quick order by another one called Brian Faulkner. And what these individuals do is after O'Neill, they all start to pander to hardline unionism, and then as soon as they're in power, they start to move towards a more central position in terms uh, of uh, of acknowledging that some reforms need to be made. And then, of course, they're immediately ousted by the next one in line, which in this point was Brian Faulkner. Later on, it would be another man called William Craig. But in the end, Faulkner proved no more capable of repairing the damage and the now open class divides in unionism that had been well suppressed before. He got away with it for a while because he wasn't an out-of-touch aristocrat like his forebears had been, but the dance between his support base, playing to his support base in hardline unionism, combined with maverick moves, and they were very maverick, to include the minority, to use the cliche, this sealed his fate. And his introduction of internment, which is like a last ditch measure, in 1971, that failed spectacularly, which forced his resignation and dissolution of the Stormont Assembly. This was the governing body. You can see it on the right there, just behind Mr. Paisley. That is Stormont as it remains today, in fact. But it wasn't occupied by a parliamentary assembly from 1971 right up until the Good Friday Agreement. And it could only be replaced unless Britain was going to pull out, which we've already looked at, and they did actually consider it, but they decided not to. And it could if it wasn't going to be replaced by a pullout, then it would have to be replaced by direct rule from Britain. So this is what happens. Britain actually starts running Northern Ireland as a sort of colonial dependency. So all of these developments were actually looked on with satisfaction from the long-term ambitions of the Reverend Ian Paisley. You can see him above, and a growing circle around him that was soon to develop into the oppositional and separate Unionist Party. That's the Democratic, what would become the Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP, as it in its abbreviated form, capturing the legions of disaffected rank and file and lower middle class Protestants away from the decaying influence of aristocrats and industrialists who had always led the Unionist Party in the past. So for the moment, Paisley, above there on the right, a huge man with a very, very strong voice, he was happy to be provocative and thereby present a far more convincing act as a hardliner than Faulkner, and even to step close to the abyss as he was, but he never went over, made sure he never went over. He's quite happy to be seen to be consorting with real extremists and paramilitary elements of loyalism, while never actually committing himself, and thus scuppering his career. So when they did things, he would give them a boost, and then with his speeches and the support messages and so on and so forth. But then once they started ending up in prison themselves, then he would abandon them and he'd say, these people are nothing to do with me. So Mr. Paisley's big time was yet still to come, not for a while yet, another 20 years or more. So he was preparing his position well. He obviously knew what was coming, and he was playing it out so that he would be the one who would lead the Unionists into an agreement. But at this stage, he wouldn't dare to admit to that. So he was playing the waiting game. Now, the remarkable thing about the opposition to the sectarian Northern Ireland statehood from circa 1968 to 71, as below, you can see one of their marches. And it was that it took the form of a social movement for civil rights and democracy. Despite the repressive powers that the state held. And although the situation was becoming more and more militarized by the day, following the introduction of the British Army, popular protest and participation in the struggle continued with remarkable resilience, not only having to face the repressions of the RUC or Royal Ulster Constabulary, but also the British Army and the disapproval often of the now appearing Republican movement. And it was finally forced off the streets altogether only by the Bloody Sunday massacre in January 1972. And what are the IRA? We haven't spoken about them for a while. Well, you can see an early IRA man out on patrol in a nationalist enclave. He's got the signatory Thompson machine gun, which is actually a very inefficient weapon, but it became associated with the early IRA. And noticeably absent during the civil rights era, the traditional physical force component of Irish republicanism was starting to reassert itself by 1970, following a major split into official and provisional wings after long-term discontent. Now, a lot of this discontent had emerged from the outcome. The Republican movement was, the official Republicans were more in favor of the civil rights movement than the provisionals were. The provisionals thought, no, we need to fight this as a military campaign, and they were becoming more and more alarmed as the state became more and more violent, and then the British Army come in and the sectarian pogroms, and the final straw of this split was seeing derisive graffiti in Catholic areas saying IRA, I ran away. And that was as far as the provisionals could stand it. They thought that the officials who were running these Republican clubs where people were discussing politics, including left-wing and Marxist politics, that they thought that these were leading people away from armed struggle. So the officials, to get to the bottom of what the two groups represent, the officials were strongest in the cities, at least early on, and the provisionals were strongest in the country areas, the more conservative Republican area. The more conservative country areas. And the stickies were also less likely to launch attacks. That meaning attacks outside the nationalist areas than the provos were. But with as far as defensive operations are concerned, there wasn't much in it. The official, well, the records for tend to give the idea that the provisionals were killing more British soldiers, but this wasn't necessarily the case. I have actually spoken to somebody who was involved in this time, and he told me that this wasn't the case at all. But it was the provisionals would immediately claim, say, a soldier getting killed or whatever, whereas the stickies would 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 not claim it, because it clashed with their political agenda, which was an electoral political agenda, which we'll come to in part 5. But so there was more. There was more secularism and so-called Marxism in the officials than in the provosts, but the split was not really ideological as such. There were groups of provosts who would be probably just as secularist and Marxist as people in the officials, and you would get just as many conservatives in the officials as in the provost. Because what normally happened was that people split in, as far as the old school Republicans, it tended to go in families, and once the leading member of the family had chosen to go with one wing, then usually everybody else in the family would go with that wing. So it was more to do with things like that than it was anything to do with ideology. So both IRA factions were recruiting steadily from 1970, and this process relating directly to each escalating move of the Kitson Doctrine being put into practice. Now, here we have 2 examples to give you some personalities involved. So the provost, that's Sean McStiffan. You can see him on the left. He, along with Dahi O'Connell and Seamus Twomey, he quickly became a key player in the provisional IRA. Now, this man was a Londoner by birth. His mother was Irish. She was actually a Belfast Protestant mother, though she had brought up her child as a Catholic. I'm not quite sure how that worked, but that and she actually had ingrained some of the Republican ideals and his Irish heritage into him. But McStiffan converted officially to Catholicism in his teenage, I think, and he became an ardent devotee. He relocated to Ireland and nurtured a deep commitment to the Gaelic language. He's credited with developing much of the early provisional tactics and strategy. Especially, he was a big advocate of the war and the offensive. This was taking the war to the British, as he put it. And then in the bottom right there, you have the sticky. I should just explain what these terms mean, right? A provo is pretty obvious what a provo means. Provo is a shortened term for provisional. Sticky is, most people think, oh, it means that they're sticking to some kind of political program, but no, this wasn't what it was all about at all. What it was about was that in the Easter parade, which is very important for event in the Republican calendar. The provost would wear the old style pin. So you wear an Easter lily pin on your, which is a metal thing, which you wear on your lapel. Whereas the stickies on their parade, well, they would wear a sticky badge. So they would have a paper badge which was stuck onto your lapel. And that's basically what it was all about. So it's got nothing to do with politics. It's got to do with what type of how you present your Easter lily. So from a traditional Dublin Republican family in North Dublin, Golding, you can see him on the right there, together with Thomas Magila and Sean Garland, they embraced pro-Soviet Marxism and a little bit of new left Marxism as well, and national liberation politics, these sorts of things. And they started on an international basis rather than just Irish focused, and started the push towards embracing constitutional politics. This would be the kernel of what the split was all about, but this would not emerge at this point. The embracing of constitutional politics was also what the USSR was encouraging at the time. And this was the real reason for the split, rather than the officials' rather vague references to socialism. So although the first, you might call it a test army invasion, had been directed not against the Catholic areas, but against the Belfast Protestant Shankill district, and it ended up in at least a couple of deaths, and really annoyed the community of the Shankill. But by 1971, when Kitson, Wilford, and so on, that once they were in position of influence, they with low intensity operations being led by all British Army officers, they had concentrated Army attention 100% into areas that were identified according to the doctrine in the book as insurgency reservoirs. Namely, these would be Catholic working class ghettos. And this practice meant sealing off these areas for long periods with checkpoints, curfews, raids, invasive home searches, arbitrary beatings and arrests, riot control in scare quotes, and most helpful of all for winning hearts and minds, of course, he said sarcastically, the casual murder of civilians. So in quick order, the provost soon had enough recruits to carry out offensive bombings, which was Sean McStephen's plan. And so you can see the results of one opposite. Now, initially, these in 1970, for instance, these were not happening very often. But by 1971, they were starting to build up, and there were the inevitable civilian casualties. The scene was therefore set for further escalation. As the war developed into near daily gun battles, so this would be sort of 1971, 72, the bombings and confrontations between civilians and soldiers, the growing strength and audacity of the IRA factions, this meant that for a large part of the time, the army was unable to exert control over nationalist or Catholic areas, without a huge show of force. And that left an unexpected opening for independent community organization. So the civilians in these liberated areas, they began to initiate strategies of their own. This came out of necessity, not ideology, it came out of necessity. Alongside radicals who were ideologized, if you like those in People's Democracy, who were, and they were trying to find ways for the community to cope with what amounted to a failed state. Because if you've got curfews going on and you can't get to the shops and you can't get to your work, and you know, the actual rate of unemployment in the Catholic area is already very high. It went straight through the roof because people couldn't get to work even if they wanted to get to work from nationalist areas. And if they did get to work, then they'd always be wondering who's going to be waiting for me on my way back home. So people had to be fed. Absent council services, because the council basically dropped all public transport amongst many other things, and then people had to get. They still needed to get these council services. So and petty disputes had to be mediated, and public transport, as I've said, needed to be completely reinvented because the bus services were after the first few bus burnings, the bus services were just taken off the streets for nationalist areas. And grassroots popular assemblies were set up to address this. So you can see this is a very famous gable end of a wall. The gable end still stands. The houses that you can see there, the partly demolished houses, they are no longer there. But that gable end much brightened up now. It's in white with it still stands to this day. And you can see a British Army patrol in an armored car. And then in the bottom one, you can see an IRA patrol. So there's an IRA man. He's got an Armalite, I think, and he's out patrolling on the streets of Belfast. This is presumably a propaganda photograph taken for the Republican movement, but you know, these things would have happened. You know, school children walking past some masked guy with an Armalite, and he'd be saying, "Hello, you know, how you doing?" And the kids would all say something similar back to him, and so on and so forth. This was all quite normal. You would not be saying that to the British Army. The British Army had completely alienated themselves by this point from the local population. So we're going to play. This is what's known as the Belfast, the Falls Road Taxi Service. Now, the Falls Road Taxi Service is one of these community initiatives that we should talk about, because it wasn't something dreamt up by the Republican movement. It wasn't something dreamt up by People's Democracy. It was just a bunch of largely unemployed drivers from the Falls Road. They went over to London, and in London there were these black taxis, and the black taxis were starting to be phased out of use in London. So there were a lot of them which the taxi services in London didn't want anymore, and they were very happy for people to come along and take them away for nothing. So they got hold of these black taxis from London. They drove them over in fleets from London to Belfast, and they put them to immediate work, replacing the now absent bus services. So that went up and down the Falls Road. And so you can see these services in action, and they basically got as many people into the vehicle as was humanly possible. And I mean, I can remember this service, and it was extremely cheap as well, because the drivers just wanted enough to sustain themselves and their families, and that was the only and keep their vehicles on the road, and that was all that they were concerned with, and people would be paying much smaller rates than like what they would be paying to the bus services, which now didn't exist. So I'm going to play a song here just to give you an idea as to what this was all about. This is by the Men of No Property, who were a band around at the time, a sort of folk band, and I'm going to play the Falls Road Taxi Man. Now this gives you a rough idea that it follows a taxi from the city centre up to just beyond Lenadoon, presumably Twinbrook, where the song ends. So I'll just let you listen to this, and you can get an idea as to what this was actually like.
As I roamed out through Belfast town, around by Castle Street, a seeking transportation, a young man I did meet. They said his name was Cosgrove, some called him Desperate Dan, for he risked his life 10 times a day as a Falls Road taxi man. Well, I put 2 bob into his hand, I climbed inside the car. Well, that was all they charged us for traveling near or far. With 14 other passengers, we made a noble van. As we set out from Sawyer's with the Falls Road taxi man, on board an expectant mother with not too long to wait, we hit the ramps at Histon Street. I knew it was too late, but Cosgrove he was smiling with a baby in his hand. We've just delivered a rebel boy by the Falls Road taxi man. Well, when we got to Divis Street, he said, "Now bar your door. The 12 apostles in the back, you'd better get on the floor." For an armored car was across the road, he said, "We'll have to ram." With my bumper stole from Maggie's Pride, the Falls Road taxi man. Well, when we reached the White Rock Road, on the floor we had to lie. The tracer bullets from the tanks, they were lighting up the sky. Well, above the din, a man called out, "Oh, please stop if you can. You'll have to use your parachute," cried the Falls Road taxi man. Well, when we got to Kennedy Way, the night was growing dark. We dropped another passenger just outside Casement Park. There was a riot going on. We upset the soldiers' plan. Oh, if Josh ran over, the major cried, the Bulger taxi man. We reached our destination just west of Lanadun. We knew that we would all be safe in God's own country soon, where the constant adventure and where the paratroops ran. So we all shook hands and said farewell to the Falls Road taxi man.
Okay, so that gives you an idea as to what it was like, and this service was carried on right through. I think it's still going even today, but in a much more it's changed quite a bit since then. It's not quite so community organized, orientated as it was, but it's still running as a service. I should just mention that the Shankill Road actually also set up a black taxi service. They took the idea and they went over to London, and they eventually got their own community taxi service running up and down the Shankill Road as well. Right. So returning to the IRA was caught in a hard bind because although many members approved of and took part in the popular assemblies, similarly with the civil rights marches, the historical orientation of traditional republicanism was towards authoritarianism and a voluntarist elitism. This is me paraphrasing what they were basically trying to say, but it was sort of like we alone, we're fighting and suffering for your sake, but you know the payback is that you must obey our commands. So not very democratic. So if the police and army were no longer accepted, then what could replace law and order? The practice of tarring and feathering criminals, scare quotes, as a right in Derry. This is quite an early tarring and feathering of a young fella in Derry in probably 1970 odd, and then threatening, beating, or executing them as it escalated up to the this was rather ham-fisted response, and of course these sort of responses did not meet with good public approval. It was also very bad for the morale of the IRA's rank and file, because the IRA's rank and file wanted to be out there fighting the British Army. They didn't want to be policing their own people. The British Army strategy, on the other hand, that was based on the assumption, this rather willfully stupid assumption, that if they could just force the IRA guerrillas out into the streets to fight, then it would be all over in no time, as the superior firepower, the training and the discipline of the British Army would quickly prevail. And there's big hubris attached to that belief, but they were all well in league with it. And while Kitson, Wilford, etc., chased the delusion produced by their colonial mindset, it was the people of the 6 counties who paid the price. You would say not only the people of the 6 counties, but also, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, but also the British squaddies who were being ordered around by Kitson, Wilford, etc. They were also paying the price in terms of trauma, injury, and death. And each tactic, in scare quotes, used to draw the IRA out into a so-called pitched battle that failed dramatically. All it did was it ramped up the violence, but this did not matter to the ideologues in the British Army, because it only meant that a heavier dose of the same medicine was to be applied, and then eventually you would get your result. And of course, the heavier dose just leads to more and more chaos and bloodshed. So we should just talk a little bit about this is the Ulster Defence Association. I think this is a march in 1971. They started to organize. There was also the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was another organization which had, of course, been around since the 1910s. But this one was a relatively new one, and it was encouraged, of course, by the posturings of Ian Paisley and by the statelet's own ambivalence to such historical forms of loyalist mobilization, which was to form paramilitary groups to defend unionist interests. And the new Ulster Defence Organisation, the UDA, it was able to act as a semi-legal body and an unofficial auxiliary force for counterinsurgency terror against hapless Fenians. This is how Kitson and so on were looking at them, and anyone who dared to associate with them. Largely working class, these organizations, they recruited largely working class Protestants who've been swept into the loyalist mindset. These groups were very easily penetrated by British intelligence, and with nom de plume, such as the Ulster Freedom Fighters, or UFF. That means that if they went out and killed somebody, which is usually a random Catholic, or set up a bomb in a Catholic pub, then they would say the Ulster Freedom Fighters done it, but everybody knew that it wasn't the Ulster Freedom Fighters, was just a nom de plume of the UDA. So they would be able to continue the daytime violence of the army into the long dark hours of the night, with the amount of manipulation that the British intelligence, who had easily penetrated them, were able to throw over them. So these are these guys out in the streets, having a march and getting away with it. Republicans wouldn't be able to do this sort of thing. Right. So although it was Faulkner who had introduced internment in 1971, it was the British Army who largely carried it out. So by this time, pretty much Faulkner was a puppet of the British military, in fact, and the British military were going to take a full advantage of the Special Powers Act that the Northern Ireland government had set up in the 1920s. And this was based upon faulty and outdated Royal Ulster Constabulary evidence, and also random scoops. So the internees, you can see a row of them there. They've just been the army's just pulled a whole lot of men there off the streets and in a nationalist area, and then they get transported off to the prison camp. And they were subjected to, first of all, they were subjected to white noise, sensory deprivation, and beatings. So they would put a mask over your head or bag over your head, and then they would do the white noise, and they'd give you sensory deprivation, and then they would beat you intermittently, and then they would hold you without trial or legal rights in the Nissen huts at the long disused Long Kesh airfield, which you can see out in that picture on the left there. IRA, and in particular provisional IRA membership, it grew apace during this period, both inside and outside the prisons. What a surprise. The army policy of as I say, to the ideological argument for it was that they were going to force the IRA out onto the streets by creating a situation where the IRA would have no alternative but to come out onto the streets. This was, of course, to reach its apex in January 1972 in Derry Bogside, but it was already, but they tried it before that. They tried it in August 1971 in Belfast. Ballymurphy is a Catholic working class housing estate, and they did the same tactics that were going to be used in Derry later on. A few months later, they gunned down all these people here in the pictures on the left of the picture. This is a memorial up to remember them. One of them was a woman. I think she was one of the first victims, and then the others, as they came out to see what was going on, they were gunned down as well. None of them were IRA members, and the idea was to draw the provisionals out, but or the IRA in general, just out into a battle, but it didn't work. And so they decided, well, rather than deciding, well, this tactic isn't working, they decided, well, we just haven't done it hard enough. So we move on. This is the last civil rights march in January 1972. It's in Derry, and you can see how big it is. And it was a particularly big demonstration. And they went up to the barricades, which the army had set up on the outskirts of the Bogside, because they were trying to get into the center of Derry to hold their rally. And a usual skirmish developed between youths from the Bogside and the British soldiers who were blocking their path behind barbed wire entanglements and armored cars, and that would lead to CS gas being fired. It would lead to snatch squads going out. It would lead to occasional shots being fired. But on this occasion, and it's now been proved this did actually happen, because it was originally dismissed as being IRA propaganda, but in fact this did actually happen. It was brought out in an inquiry. The the soldiers waiting behind the frontline soldiers was the first regiment of the first parachute regiment, or elements thereof, who are already experienced in shooting people dead in Ballymurphy and using the same tactics. And Wilford, remember with him, he was the officer in charge of this operation, and basically Kitson had failed to bring them out in Belfast, so Wilford decided he was going to upstage Kitson. He said, "I'll do it right this time." So he sent in the troops immediately. The confrontation started. There were people trying to ameliorate on both sides. Particularly, I shouldn't say both sides, but on the side of the civil rights marches, there were constitutional politicians like John Hume, etc. They were trying to argue with the soldiers and trying to calm the situation as they saw it, and the army just came storming in, the parachute regiment, and they opened fire on the crowd, and then the crowd ran back. And the soldiers started setting up sniper positions because the crowd was dispersing, and then they started to just gun people down as they'd done in Ballymurphy. And there were 14 deaths. We shall have a look at them now. Well, this is one of the bodies being taken through the streets. This is Father Edward Daly, who shielded some of the bodies that were being taken away, in the hope that the soldiers wouldn't fire on him. He did actually survive. And there you can see one of the dead bodies being taken away. And these are the 14 victims of this massacre. And you can see all 14 of them there, mostly young people. I think the youngest is 16, and none of them involved in the IRA. And once again, it was the idea was to draw the IRA out into ambush. Actually, the only shots that were fired, this was after the crowds dispersed, was actually by a few official IRA, not provisional IRA members, who saw what was going on, and they decided that they needed to open up on the army as well. But by this time, all the civilians, those that were alive, of course, were off the streets. And and there were only a handful of shots fired because the paratroops quickly, once the mission had been accomplished, they pulled back, and the British started immediately the campaign. Yes, they'd been fired on, and there was a gun battle with the IRA, and they killed, and all these 14 people got slandered as being IRA men, which is complete nonsense. But it would take 30 years of struggle for that truth finally to be acknowledged. So the achievements of the Bloody Sunday campaign, or the Bloody Sunday massacre, were incredible. That's, if you consider them to be achievements. The Provisional IRA's campaign went into overdrive during 1972 to 73, and this first marginalized and then finally eclipsed the official IRA, who tried to keep up in a way which they shouldn't really have bothered doing, but they did, and they made a right hash of it, and that put them out of the picture altogether. Well, what actually really was putting them out of the picture was the drift in the leadership of the official Republican movement into electoral politics, but we can deal with that in the next episode. So as far as the Provos are concerned, commercial bombings, pub bombings, shootings, and attacks on army police patrols and barracks shot up as the PIRA relentlessly pursued its war of the offensive. You can see that picture above, I think, is actually in London. It's not, because there were starting to be now few bombs going off in Britain. We haven't quite reached the Birmingham pub bombings yet, but there were bombs going off in England as well. But this would have been normal in Belfast and Derry, of course, as well. So in a cruel and ironic way, the provisional campaign was, in a sense, becoming a near mirror image of that pursued by the British Army leadership. No thought now was to be given to politics, a dirty word amongst the adherents of expelling the occupying forces through physical force alone. They obviously hadn't been reading their Mao. And eager, youthful volunteers with the trauma of occupation freshly seared into their consciousnesses from the beatings and the sensory deprivation and so on and so forth, which they suffered if they'd been interned under the Special Power Act. These were in no short supply. So on a summer's Friday in 1972, the provisional IRA, I think it was August 1972, the provisionals started to make cock-ups themselves. Well, they were already making cock-ups, because you're getting these very young guys and girls into vehicles, telling them to go and plant this bomb, and then there had to be the backup service. The backup service was supposed to give the warning, but often this didn't happen. It certainly didn't happen in the way it was supposed to be. Very highly organized, and often wasn't. And the provisionals hit upon this idea of to show how powerful we are, we're going to set off 30 bombs in one day in Belfast city centre. And this was, of course, catastrophic. And it led to 9 deaths, most of those being Protestants, because by this time Protestants were pretty much the only people in the city centre, and 130 injuries. So loyalists now too had their own Bloody Friday. So that was a bit of an own goal as far as the provisionals were concerned. So we should just talk a little bit about the sort of volunteers which they were getting around this time. They're quite dramatic personalities, and quite interesting in the sense that neither of these two characters came from traditional Republican families. The period produced many figures from very ordinary and previously unpoliticized backgrounds who become the stuff of Republican legend. Michael McVerry, you can see him below on the left. He was a fearless provisional IRA volunteer from the village of Crossmaglen in South Armagh. He was on active service from about 1970, and he was detained by the Southern Police because the Crossmaglen is very close to the border. He's back and forward across the border a lot to get supplies and to get recruits and to get weapons. and he was detained by the police of the Irish Republic, and but he escaped by tunnel from prison, entered back into service immediately, and he was taking part in daily active service operations. And in one of these, he actually lost one of his hands. But that didn't stop him, and he went on carrying on because he believed the provisional IRA ideology, which was physical force can get rid of the British alone. So by 1972, fate finally caught up with him, and he was killed while making an attack on a border town police barracks. Now we'll talk a bit about Big Joe McCann. You can see him in a rather iconic photograph that was made of him, I think, in 1971, shortly before he was killed, where he was actually he defended a factory, a disused factory in the markets area of Belfast. Him and a few other volunteers held off the entire British Army for over 24 hours, I think. And that's his iconic photograph of him masked up with an M1 carbine, and the streets ablaze around him. He was known as the Che Guevara of the IRA, due to his reputation as a leading from the front commander, combined with an unusually high level of class consciousness for either organization, that's either the officials or the stickies. He was eventually killed in an early shoot-to-kill stakeout by paratroopers. Of interest is that he pardoned a trio of captured UVF, that's Ulster Volunteer Force, Protestant paramilitary or Loyalist paramilitary. He captured a trio of them, or his men did, and he interrogated them, and he eventually released them because he said this is on the basis of you being working class like I am, and therefore you're not to blame for, you haven't killed anybody, you were just spying, and you haven't got much information, so we're just going to send you back to your community. And in this situation, this was where execution would have been the norm, but didn't happen in this place. And the UVF commander even paid McCann due respects when he was killed, as did in fact the provisionals. So we move on now. The role of women in the IRA should not be overlooked either. Cumann na mBan, that's the IRA, the IRA women's wing. This organization had, of course, existed ever since the start of the IRA and the Irish Volunteers. It existed ever since about 1913, and despite being often marginalized in a very male-focused movement, it also produced some of its most socially radical elements. The women were more likely to be socialists, and they were more likely as well to be feminists. And in the 1920s, in fact, or the period of the 1916 Rising onwards, the women who were in Cumann na mBan were often also suffragettes. So, but in the 1970s, despite this the radical chic of the propaganda picture, which you can see on the left, women IRA volunteers were most often relegated to police duties, in scare quotes down below, or intelligence work, or carrying weapons for the boys to use, as such roles were seen as being more appropriate to their gender. So you can see a command-the-man street investigation of somebody whom they think is suspect, so they're searching, frisking him down while he's under gunpoint. We should also mention that enormous progress was made by the British Army and its local cohorts in terms of riot control and militarized police repression during this period. At the start of the Troubles, as it's known, the Royal Ulster Constabulary were already carrying and being trained in firearms as a matter of course. They'd always done this ever since they were founded, and had access to stockpiles of CS gas and water cannon. The British Army's contribution to this already impressive arsenal was to bring in full body shields, riot armor, snatch squads, sniper executions, armored cars used as weapons to run people over, and last but by no means least, the rubber bullet, opposite, soon to be upgraded to the plastic bullet. This potentially lethal weapon could be fired from a CS gas projector. It was large, hard, and heavy. We're going to listen to a song in a minute, which is also, again, by the people of No Property. It's called Rubber Bullets. So this is a sort of comedic song which satirizes the use of of rubber bullets. They were approximately 5 inches long and 3 inches wide, and very heavy. And in addition, the terms of range, they were supposed to be only used at a certain range, and they were supposed to be only used at certain target areas that were the limbs were supposed to be the only places targeted. But these were not so often followed, and the soldiers became skilled at firing at point blank, aiming for head body shots, often doctoring the rounds with nails, razor blades, and other sadistic add-ons. So we're going to play the song now, and then you'll get an idea of what rubber bullets were like.
Rubber bullets for the ladies, catch them in the CS can. 3 inches wide, 6 inches long, take it home to your old man. It's an instrument of torture to break your legs in two. It'll stop you feeling lonely, but leave you black and blue. When you've had your full of CS gas behind the barricade, and served your time with half bricks, you've learned a brand new trade. You're fighting for your freedom, the dignity of man. Look out for rubber bullets, it's the army's latest plan. Rubber bullets for the ladies, catch them in the CS can. 3 inches wide, 6 inches long, take it home to your old man. It's an instrument of torture to break your legs in two. It'll stop you feeling lonely, but leave you black and blue. And if your army's going hungry, curfewing will break your heart. The army solved your problem, you can bake a rubber tart. When you're under house arrest and your nerves are getting fried, the prescription's rubber bullets fired from underneath the bed. Rubber bullets for the ladies, catch them in the CS can. 3 inches wide, 6 inches long, take it home to your old man. It's an instrument of torture to break your legs in two. It'll stop you feeling lonely, but leave you black and blue. blue. Aye, and don't forget the highway code when crossing of the street, for a bullet doing 90 could leave you obsolete. Aye, and watch when stepping up the curb and being quite sincere. A bullet in the proper place could leave you feeling queer. Rubber bullets for the ladies, catch them in the sea as can. 3 inches wide, 6 inches long, take it home to your own man. It's an instrument of torture to break your legs in two. It'll stop you feeling lonely, but leave you black and blue. And when the soldier says he loves you behind the barricade, look out for rubber bullets, aye, and grab his red cockade. Cause the bullet's meant to stun you, but be careful how you bend. If it breaks a leg or two, the army's sure to comprehend. Rubber bullets for the ladies, catch them in the sea as can. 3 inches wide, 6 inches long, take it home to your own man. It's an instrument of torture to break your legs in two. It'll stop you feeling lonely, but leave you black and blue.
Okay, we should, on a slightly more serious note, we should acknowledge that one of the first victims of the rubber bullets, in terms of victims, of course, there were lots of people who were victimized by it, but in terms of serious casualty, was Emma Groves of West Belfast. And she was a middle-aged woman who was mutilated and blinded in both eyes by a soldier who invaded her garden, and then he shot her as she looked out of the window at the intruder, shot her in the face at point blank range. And of course, it took the army donkey's years to actually acknowledge that they did this, but they did do it before she died. Right, a few words should be said before we move on about the rural experience in this era, lest we seem to be concentrating too much on the impact on big urban centres such as Belfast and Derry. In the country, the old wrongs, well-remembered wrongs of the 16th to 17th century land grab by the Protestant ascendancy, these remained. And here too, religion and sectarianism were mutually closely linked and were part of daily life. The picture above, this shows what occupation was like in a rural area. The picture above shows a Gaelic football game about to begin at Crossmaglen GAA pitch, that's Gaelic Athletic Association pitch, under the watchful eye of the local army/police barracks. So helicopters would land day and night on the hour, because as otherwise the base was cut off because the local roads were too dangerous and far too risky for supply purposes. So the local people had to put up with this, not only overlooking the pitch there of the Gaelic games, but also it was also, I've actually been to Crossmaglen. I've been in the pub in the city, the village square, and the helicopters. So I just ordered a pint, and I was sitting there in the bar with a couple of friends, and then the helicopter just landed in. It felt like it was coming through the roof. That's what it sounded like, and the whole room shook. But this was just like a daily. This happened to them every hour of every day. That this was going on, and it went on for decades. So you can imagine what sort of trauma and resentment people were building up in these areas against what was quite obviously. I mean, this picture above, it looks like something out of the occupied West Bank or something. So you know, you definitely it's just going to reinforce that you're under occupation. So the border areas with its numerous small unapproved roads and lanes where during this period and beyond, dotted with sinister watchtowers high on the hillsides. Actually, the watchtowers came more later on. But which were each equipped with spying techno gadgetry, and once again supplied and manned only by helicopters. So that would, especially if Crossmaglen for barracks, for example, was a base, then as well as supplying the actual base itself, they were also supplying these various checkpoints and watchtowers. So, and cross-border roads, which of course farmers needed to use the cross-border roads because their farms were on both sides of the border and their fields were on both sides of the border, and they were being ritually blocked, these unapproved, so-called unapproved roads, by the army, and they were just as ritually opened again by the local farmers. So, you know, this was going on in the rural areas. We should also mention this was predominantly a rural outfit, the Ulster Defence Regiment. The British establishment were very keen from the start to disband the RUC B Special Constabulary. If you want to know who the B Specials were, look at an earlier episode. And replace it with some new outfit, spanking new outfit, but hopefully one less controversial and obviously sectarian, but paradoxically able to fill the same quasi colonial paramilitary support role for the police. I wonder how you're going to do that. Well, they didn't do it very well. Traditionally, the B Specials have been seen, particularly by rural Protestants of a unionist persuasion, as protection from being massacred in their sleep by the banished natives of the hills if these people ever got to return to the land that had in ages gone by been stolen from them. There was some limited justification for this belief, as we've already explored a little bit. Northern rural republicanism could be quite sectarian in its nature, and it did contain elements who believed in a similar zero-sum us or them solution. The British solution, however, was to form a local regiment affiliated to the British Army, who is to be known as the Ulster Defence Regiment, or UDR. But in short time, it was very obviously revealed as being yet another militia, exactly the same as the B Specials, basically, and it became a mere continuation of the old Special Constabulary, but under a new name. One wonders if the designer of this recruiting poster for the early UDR ever realized the ironic Orwellian parallel in his words. One hopes he was having a private joke, but one suspects he wasn't. So peace, UDR, peace through strength. Welcome to 1984. By late 1973, an alarmed British political establishment was trying to seek a shaky political solution in the face of opposition from their own military COs, as we've been talking about. The Kitsons and the Wilfords of this world wanted to carry on. Oh, well, we haven't killed enough of them. That'll bring the provisionals out onto the streets. So to achieve this end, Kitson, there was a Tory government back in charge by 1973, and Kitson was kicked upstairs and promoted to general. And then he was eventually to become overall commander-in-chief of Her Majesty's Land Forces in the 1980s. He was awarded this title at the same time as he was awarded his OBE, and also when he was it became an official advisor to the Queen. So the victims of his 3-decade-long career of colonial war crimes committed in Malaya, Kenya, and Northern Ireland, and the catastrophic failure of these, because they hadn't managed to keep hold of Malaya, and they hadn't managed to keep hold of Kenya either. All these people were to be sacrificed for this compromise. The negotiations brought together the reformist, nationalist, Social Democratic and Labour Party, that also known as the SDLP, led by John Hume, with the official Unionist Party, who was seen now as being a more milder version of the Unionists, to kickstart a reconfigured devolution that would eradicate, or at least in theory, many of the worst features of the previous regime, the worst sectarian features. The provisionals, too, were involved in these secret talks, as their agreement to a ceasefire would naturally be required. Just worthy putting in a small aside here, the provisionals were starting to realize that maybe they weren't going to be able to bomb Britain out of Ireland. By 1974, the provisionals were noticing that their number of recruits was starting to flag off, and perhaps the campaign wasn't working quite according to plan. So you have new people stepping forward. This is the first appearance of these secret talks are actually the first appearance of people like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. But however, news of these talks at Sunningdale in England between the Heath government and these various factions here, these were leaked prematurely and fell into the eagerly awaiting hands of Ian Paisley and his allies, who included William Craig, who was the leading light at the time. Ian Paisley was still trying to get William Craig out of the way so that he could replace him. But they organized a mass movement with help from the UDA to stop these talks in a populist loyalist uprising known as the Ulster Workers' Strike. You can see this is them marching on Stormont for a big parade. Paisley loved these grand parades, as did William Craig, of course. By cleverly manipulating rank and file Protestant opinion, which, as they were to be left out of the deal, was arguably justified, Paisley's move sank, or Paisley and Craig's move sank Sunningdale in a week, and increased, in particular, it didn't really do much for Craig. Craig didn't come out of this too well, but Paisley did, and he increased his niche popularity immeasurably. So that's the end of this episode. The next episode we'll be moving on to the later 1970s and the disillusion setting in on all sides, and some quite dark periods, because the British Army still continued their policy, and they're still looking to escalate. And there's on a governmental level, there's a move towards what's known as normalization or Ulsterization, which is to pretend that everything's being returned to normal. So we'll be investigating all that stuff and what derails this whole thing, which is the prison protests, and eventually the hunger strikes. So that's all for episode 5. So hope to see you then. Thank you very much.